in 1991 inside a cold operating room in Phoenix, Arizona. A woman named Pam Reynolds underwent one of the most extreme surgical procedures modern medicine could perform, a rare operation in which doctors had to lower her body temperature dramatically, stop her heart, drain the blood from her brain, and monitor her brain activity as it fell silent, because the only way to reach the aneurysm threatening her life was to bring her body to the edge of what medicine itself classifies as clinical death. This was not symbolic death, not poetic death, and not the loose everyday language people use when they describe a close call. Her body had been placed into a condition where conscious experience, according to the standard material picture, should not have been available at all. And yet her later account did not sound like the report of a mind fading into confusion or blankness. She said she observed the surgical team. She described instruments. She recalled details of the procedure and conversations in the room that staff later said matched what had actually happened. Those details are the part most people focus on because they sound impossible in the ordinary sense, and they force an immediate argument over whether she truly perceived anything from outside her body. But the deeper disturbance in her account lies somewhere else, in the way she described the structure of the experience itself, because what she presented was not simply an out-of-body narrative. It was a description of perception without ordinary time. She did not speak about events as though they were arriving one after another in the sequence you and I usually take for granted. She described a condition in which the usual markers of time had disappeared, where there was no real sense of before and after. No familiar movement from one instant into the next, but instead a kind of expanded present, a state that seemed complete in itself. That detail matters more than it first appears to, because once you remove sequence, you are no longer talking only about an unusual medical event. You are touching the foundations of how reality is normally organized in experience. What makes this so difficult to dismiss is that our confidence in linear time rarely comes from deep examination. It comes from habit. You wake up, move through the day, remember yesterday, anticipate tomorrow, and the mind stitches all of this into a continuous thread so smoothly that it feels self-evident. Time seems to pass because experience seems ordered, and experience seems ordered because consciousness presents reality in that form. But a case like Pam Reynolds interrupts that arrangement. It introduces the possibility that what feels most basic to you may not be basic at all. Only familiar, that is where the real fracture begins. Because if awareness can persist in a condition where the body's normal timing mechanisms are absent or radically altered, then the sense of flowing time may not be built into consciousness as deeply as we assume. It may belong instead to the way consciousness is usually filtered through the brain under ordinary conditions. In daily life, that filter is so stable that you hardly notice it. Under extreme conditions, the filter appears to loosen. And when it does, the world no longer arrives in the same shape. None of this proves by itself that time is unreal or that near-death experiences reveal a final metaphysical truth. It does something both smaller and more important. It removes the feeling of certainty. It shows that the model most people live by, where consciousness depends entirely on normal brain function and time moves in a simple line from past to future, is not as secure as it first appears. Once that certainty gives way, even slightly, the question changes shape. The event is no longer just strange. It becomes difficult to place inside the ordinary story we tell about what a human mind is allowed to experience. And that difficulty is where the larger inquiry begins. Most people never question what memory actually is, not in a serious way, because it feels so obvious that it hardly seems worth examining You remember something? And that memory appears to come from somewhere behind you, as if your past was stored intact and waiting to be accessed, like a recording that can be replayed whenever you choose. But the closer neuroscience looks at this process, the less that familiar picture holds together. And what replaces it is not just a small correction, but a complete shift in how memory works. When you recall an event, your brain does not retrieve a fixed copy of what happened. It does not pull a preserved file from storage and display it in its original form. Instead, it reconstructs the experience in real time using networks of neurons that recreate patterns similar to those active during the original moment, which means that what you are experiencing is not the past itself, but a present moment reconstruction that carries the feeling of the past without actually being located there. This is not a philosophical interpretation layered on top of biology. It is how the system operates at a measurable level. Because when scientists observe the brain during recall, they do not see a passive playback. They see active assembly, regions coordinating, signals firing, fragments being integrated into something coherent, and that coherence is convincing enough that you rarely question it, even though it is being generated now rather than retrieved from then. And once you recognize that, something subtle begins to shift. Because if every memory you have ever experienced only exists as an activity in the present, then the past is not something you travel back to. It is something that appears within your current awareness, shaped by the brain's attempt to reconstruct it, which raises a problem that does not have an easy answer. Because if the past only exists when it is reconstructed, then outside of those moments of recall, it does not exist in any form you can directly access. You can test this without any theory, because all it takes is attention. Bring to mind a moment that feels vivid, something with emotional weight. And notice how it does not feel distant in the way a physical object would be if it were located somewhere else. It feels immediate, almost present, not because it has returned from the past, but because your brain is generating it again within the same field of awareness you are using right now. And that immediacy is not a trick. It is a consequence of how memory functions. What complicates this even further is that the act of remembering is not neutral, because each reconstruction is influenced by your current state, your expectations, your beliefs, and even subtle changes in neural structure over time, which means that every time you recall something, you are not simply accessing it. You are modifying it, updating it, and then storing that altered version for the next recall. So the past becomes something that is not only present-bound, but also continuously reshaped by the present. At this point, the distinction between past and present starts to lose the clarity it seemed to have, because one is no longer a fixed domain. You can revisit while the other is your current experience. Instead, both are entangled in a process that only unfolds now, where what you call the past is an interpretation assembled in real time. And what you call the present includes not just immediate perception, but reconstructed experience as well. This does not mean that events did not occur or that history is an illusion in a trivial sense, but it does mean that your access to those events is always mediated through present activity, never through direct contact with something that exists independently in a separate temporal location. And once that is taken seriously, the idea of a stable timeline stretching behind you becomes less of a given and more of a conceptual model that your mind uses to organize experience. Seen from that angle, memory is not a window into what was, but a process that brings fragments into coherence within the only frame you ever actually inhabit. And the past, as something directly experienced never appears anywhere else. The shift that begins with memory does not stay confined to the brain, because once you accept that the past only ever appears within the present, the next question naturally moves outward toward the structure of reality itself. And this is where physics, particularly the work of Albert Einstein, introduces a perspective that does not simply challenge your intuition about time, but replaces it with something that operates on an entirely different set of assumptions. In classical thinking, time behaves like a universal backdrop, a shared ticking rhythm that everything in the universe follows. But relativity removes that foundation completely, because it shows that time is not absolute. It does not pass at the same rate for all observers. And more importantly, it cannot be separated from space as an independent dimension. Instead, forming a unified structure known as space-time, where events are located not just in space but in time as well, all within the same framework. From this perspective, the distinction between past, present, and future does not exist as a fundamental feature of reality, because what you call now is not a universal slice shared across the universe. It is relative to your position, your motion, and your frame of reference, which means that two observers moving differently can disagree on what counts as the present without either of them being wrong. And once that becomes unavoidable, the idea of a single flowing present begins to dissolve. What replaces it is often described as the block universe, a model in which all events, regardless of whether you label them as past, present, or future, exist within a four-dimensional structure that is complete and unchanging, not because nothing happens, but because everything that happens is already located within this structure. Just as every point in space exists, regardless of whether you are currently there to observe it. To understand what this implies, you have to set aside the habit of thinking in sequences, because in this model, your life is not something that is gradually coming into existence moment by moment, but something that already occupies a continuous stretch within space-time, from the event you call your birth to the event you call your death, and every state in between, all laid out within the same structure, each moment as real as any other. Regardless of whether you are currently experiencing it, this does not mean that change is an illusion in the sense that nothing differs from one moment to the next, because differences between events are still there, encoded in the structure itself. But it does mean that the sense of movement from one moment to another is not a property of the structure. It is something that emerges from how you experience different parts of it, as if your awareness were traversing a path through something that is already complete. That idea can be difficult to hold on to, because everything about your experience reinforces the impression that time is moving, that the future is open and the past is fixed. But relativity does not require that interpretation. It only requires that events are arranged in space-time with specific relationships to one another. And those relationships do not include a universal direction of flow. Only a geometry that defines how events are connected. When you follow that through, it leads to a quiet but significant shift, because the version of you that existed years ago is not something that has vanished. It remains part of the same structure, just as inaccessible from your current perspective as a distant location in space, and the version of you that you would normally place in the future is not something waiting to be created, but something that also occupies its own position within that structure. Even though you are not currently aware of it, this does not settle the question of how experience unfolds, and it does not resolve the tension between what you feel and what the physics suggests. But it reframes the problem, because instead of asking how time moves, you are left considering how a fixed structure gives rise to the experience of sequence. And that shift does not immediately provide an answer, but it changes what needs to be explained. The picture that emerges from relativity already challenges the idea that time flows, but it still leaves one crucial assumption intact, which is that events, wherever they are located in space-time, possess definite properties independent of whether they are being observed, and it is precisely this assumption that begins to break down when you move from the scale of planets and stars to the domain of atoms and subatomic particles, where quantum mechanics replaces certainty with something far less stable. At that level, the objects you might expect to behave like tiny versions of everyday things do not settle into fixed states unless something interacts with them in a specific way. Because an electron, for example, does not simply sit at a single location waiting to be measured. It exists in a spread of possible positions, a superposition that cannot be reduced to a definite value until an interaction occurs. And this is not due to a lack of knowledge or a limitation in measurement, but a feature of how the system is described mathematically and verified experimentally. What makes this difficult to interpret is that the transition from multiple possibilities to a single outcome is not described in the same way as the rest of the system, because the equations allow for superpositions to evolve smoothly, but they do not specify exactly how or why one particular result is selected when a measurement is made, which leaves a gap between the formalism and the experience of definite outcomes, a gap that has been approached in different ways but never entirely closed. One approach treats measurement as a purely physical process, an interaction between systems that leads to a stable result through decoherence, effectively spreading information into the environment until interference between possibilities becomes negligible. And from that point of view, no special role needs to be assigned to observers, because the system resolves itself through physical dynamics alone. Yet even in that framework, the question of why a single outcome is experienced rather than a superposition of outcomes remains tied to how observation is ultimately registered. Another approach, more controversial but difficult to dismiss entirely, considers whether the act of observation, in the sense of an event becoming part of conscious experience, is linked to the resolution of possibilities, not as a magical intervention, but as a boundary where the abstract description of the system becomes an actualized experience. And while this idea has been debated for decades, it persists because the transition from potential to actual is not something you ever encounter directly in the equations, but only in the moment something is known. If you connect this with the earlier discussion of the block universe, the situation becomes more intricate, because you are no longer dealing with a fixed structure of already determined events in a straightforward way, but with a framework in which possibilities exist at the quantum level, and yet the larger structure appears consistent and stable, which suggests that what you experience as a definite sequence may involve a continuous process of resolving possibilities into specific outcomes along the path your awareness takes through that structure. This does not imply that consciousness creates reality in a simplistic or unrestricted sense, because the range of possible outcomes is constrained by the underlying physical laws, but it does indicate that the boundary between what is possible and what is experienced is not trivial, and that the role of observation cannot be entirely separated from the emergence of a definite world. Even if the exact mechanism remains unclear from your perspective, none of this is visible in a direct way, because you do not perceive superpositions or probability amplitudes. You perceive stable objects, continuous motion, and well-defined events, yet the stability you experience may be the result of processes that are constantly resolving uncertainty into definite form at scales too small for you to notice, giving rise to a world that appears fixed while being grounded in something fundamentally probabilistic. This does not resolve the tension between a static space-time and an indeterminate quantum substrate, but it places the problem in a different context, where the question is no longer simply how time behaves, but how a field of possibilities becomes the structured sequence of experiences you recognize as reality, and why that sequence appears singular when the underlying description allows for more than one outcome. There is still something unresolved at this point, because even if space-time does not flow, and even if the quantum level introduces indeterminacy rather than sequence, your experience remains stubbornly directional. You remember the past, you anticipate the future, and everything seems to unfold in a way that feels ordered rather than random, which suggests that whatever creates this sense of direction is not eliminated by the physics we have discussed, but arises from somewhere else. That somewhere else is often traced to entropy, not as an abstract concept, but as a statistical property of physical systems, describing how many different configurations correspond to a given state, and why systems tend to evolve from less probable arrangements to more probable ones. Not because there is a guiding force pushing them forward in time, but because there are overwhelmingly more ways for matter to be disordered than ordered, making certain transitions vastly more likely than their reverse. You see this pattern so consistently that it becomes invisible, because when something breaks, decays, or spreads out, it does not appear unusual. It appears expected, while the reverse process feels impossible, even though it is not forbidden by the underlying laws. And this asymmetry creates a directional gradient in the behavior of systems, one that your mind interprets as a temporal arrow. Even though the equations governing those systems do not contain any built-in notion of past or future, from the standpoint of physics, there is no fundamental rule that says time must move in one direction. But there is a statistical reality that certain sequences of states are far more probable than others. And once you combine that with the way your brain encodes information, storing traces of previous states and using them to predict future ones, the result is a coherent experience of flow, where each moment appears to arise from the one before it and lead into the next. This is not because time itself is carrying events forward, but because your perception is anchored to a gradient of increasing entropy, where memory aligns with lower entropy states and expectation aligns with higher entropy states, creating a consistent orientation that feels like movement. Even though what is actually changing are the configurations of matter and the patterns of information your brain is tracking, that also explains why your sense of time is not uniform, because it depends on how much information is being processed, how many distinctions are being registered, and how densely experiences are encoded. So in situations where your attention is heightened and more detail is captured, moments appear to stretch, while in situations where fewer distinctions are made, large spans of clock time can pass with very little subjective duration, revealing that what you experience as time is closely tied to how your brain organizes change rather than to any external flow. When viewed from this angle, the continuity of time begins to look less like a property of the world and more like a construction that emerges from the interaction between physical processes and cognitive systems, where entropy provides the directional bias, and the brain translates that bias into a narrative of sequence, stability, and causation, allowing you to navigate reality effectively without needing direct access to its underlying structure. This does not mean that change is unreal or that events are not connected, But it does mean that the sense of being carried along by time may not correspond to something that exists independently of how those changes are processed and interpreted, leaving you with a model in which the world evolves through differences in state, while the experience of flow arises from how those differences are perceived and organized. By the time you reach this point, the idea that consciousness is strictly confined to a linear sequence of moments has already begun to lose some of its stability, not because it has been disproven outright, but because there are too many observations at the edges of experience that do not fit comfortably within that model. And these observations become harder to ignore when they begin to converge from different directions, each pointing toward the same possibility from a different angle. Near-death experiences are often the most direct examples, not because they provide definitive answers, but because they present a consistent pattern that resists simple explanation, where individuals whose brains show severely reduced or absent activity report structured, coherent awareness, not fragmented or chaotic, but organized in a way that suggests continuity without relying on the usual markers of time. And what stands out in many of these accounts is not just the clarity of perception, but the absence of sequence, the sense that experiences are not arranged one after another, but exist in a kind of simultaneous presence that does not depend on progression. Attempts to reduce these experiences to hallucination or residual brain activity encounter a limitation when they try to account for the specific way time is described, because what is reported is not simply distortion, but a different mode of organization altogether, one in which the usual boundaries between past, present, and future are no longer maintained. In the same way, suggesting that the structure of experience can change under certain conditions rather than simply degrade. A different line of inquiry, more subtle but methodologically controlled, appears in experiments on precognition, where physiological responses, such as changes in heart rate or skin conductance, have been observed to shift shortly before the presentation of randomly selected stimuli. And while these effects are small and often debated, they have been reported across multiple studies with statistical patterns that are difficult to attribute entirely to chance, raising the possibility that the relationship between consciousness and time may not be limited to the immediate present in a straightforward sense. Even if one remains cautious about the interpretation of such findings, they sit alongside everyday variations in temporal experience that are easier to verify, where the perceived duration of events changes depending on attention, emotion, and cognitive load, revealing that what you call time is not something you directly perceive as an independent entity, but something inferred from the density and structure of experience, which can expand or contract without any corresponding change in external measurement. There are also phenomena that occupy a less formal space but are widely reported, such as dreams that contain extended narratives within short periods of clock time, moments of déjà vu where the present appears to overlap with something that has not yet occurred, and sudden shifts in awareness that feel disconnected from the usual sequence of events, each of which can be approached through neurological explanations. Yet collectively, they indicate that the relationship between consciousness and temporal order is more flexible than a strictly linear model would suggest. Long before these observations were framed in scientific terms, various contemplative traditions described states of awareness in which time is no longer experienced as a sequence, but as a unified presence, not as a metaphor, but as a direct feature of experience. And while these accounts arise from different cultural contexts, they share a common structure that parallels what is now being considered in physics and neuroscience, not in detail, But in the general idea that the ordinary perception of time may not be the only way consciousness can operate, taken together, these lines of evidence do not form a single conclusive theory, but they do outline a pattern in which consciousness appears capable of functioning under conditions that are not fully aligned with sequential time, suggesting that what you normally experience may represent one configuration among others rather than the full extent of what is possible, and that the apparent dependence of awareness on linear progression may be more contingent than fundamental. At this stage, the question is no longer whether time behaves the way you once assumed, but how all of these perspectives can be held together without collapsing into contradiction. Because you have a model from relativity where all moments coexist, a framework from quantum mechanics where possibilities resolve into definite outcomes, an explanation from entropy that accounts for directional experience, and a growing set of observations suggesting that consciousness is not entirely confined to a strict sequence, and what begins to emerge from this is not a single answer, but a shift in how the problem itself is framed. Instead of asking where you are in time, it becomes more precise to ask how time appears within your experience. Because one of the few things that has remained consistent throughout everything we have examined is that every moment you have ever known has occurred as a present experience, not as a direct encounter with the past or the future, but as something unfolding within awareness, which means that whatever time is, it is always encountered through this single interface. This may sound trivial at first, but it has deeper implications than it appears. Because if all experience is confined to what you call now, then past and future are not locations you directly visit. They are constructs inferred from memory and expectation, both of which operate within the present. And this places the emphasis not on time as an external dimension you move through, but on the processes by which your mind organizes information into a temporal structure. From the standpoint of the block universe, this aligns with the idea that your life is not being generated moment by moment, but exists as a continuous structure within space-time, while from the standpoint of quantum mechanics, the particular sequence you experience may reflect a path through a field of possibilities that resolves into definite outcomes. And from the standpoint of neuroscience, the sense of continuity is maintained by the brain's ability to reconstruct and integrate information in a way that preserves coherence across experiences. When these elements are considered together, the notion of a four-dimensional self becomes less abstract, because the version of you that exists at different moments can be understood as different cross-sections of a larger structure, each with its own configuration, its own perspective, and its own localized experience, none of which replaces the others, but all of which coexist within the same framework, even though you are only directly aware of one at a time. This does not require that you abandon the practical use of time, because the distinctions between past, present, and future remain useful for organizing action and communication. But it does suggest that those distinctions may not reflect the underlying structure of reality in a literal sense, and that the continuity you experience is something that arises from how your awareness engages with that structure, rather than something imposed by the structure itself. From within this view, what you call now is not a moving point traveling along a timeline, but the condition under which any experience becomes available at all, a condition that does not shift from one moment to another, even though the content of experience changes. And this reframing places time not as a container that holds you, but as a conceptual framework that your mind uses to relate different aspects of experience to one another. The result is not a final conclusion that resolves every question, but a different orientation one in which the emphasis moves away from time as an external force and toward the role of consciousness in structuring experience, leaving open the possibility that what you have been treating as a continuous flow may instead be the way a more complex, multidimensional reality is presented within the limits of perception.